Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Responsive Podcast. We are devoting this episode exclusively to the news that just came out a few hours ago that a great legend, as President Trump called him, unfortunately passed away. Charlie Kirk, the founder of the Turning Point movement. He was only 31 years old. He had two children. He was a married man. He was shot. The shooter, as far as we know, is still at large. He was about to start a discussion at the Utah Valley University. I guess just a bit of background on Charlie. He was from Illinois and he was a political activist. He started when he was young in his parents' garage. He would go to campuses and speak to students, conservative, obviously. And I think a lot of the listeners on this show know who Charlie was. And he really built up a movement that was so important for the Trump campaign, for connecting to young people. Born in 1993, he was just at the end of the millennial generation and was tapped into Gen Z. He was a close confidant. He was close with President Trump. Of course, President Trump is the one who announced that he finally passed away. He was shot around 12, and a few hours later, it was announced that he passed away. It was really a horrific shooting. He was shot in all of this was caught on camera. He was shot in the neck, it's really horrific. But, and so now we're going to take the time to reflect on his legacy and what this means in the country, because this is a turning point. I guess before you go ahead, Josh, again, like I said, I want to give a background on this movement. This was basically a right-wing young people's movement. When Charlie was in high school, he always used to say he didn't have no one. He was openly conservative and he didn't have any friends, right? No one really shared his opinions. And he changed that. And he really worked to change that, to make it cool to be a conservative. And he would go to these campuses, to big state universities, even private universities, although we'll discuss that, what universities he was even really invited to. But he would come to these universities, he would set up a stand, and people would come, ask him a question, and they would discuss. And all this would be recorded. He would generally answer their question, all topics from the Second Amendment, abortion, taxes, economics, foreign policy, all these things. And, these were open, recorded discussions, free speech. Anyone could ask whatever questions they wanted, and he would present his opinion. And so he's really, he was an inspiration. I remember watching him when he started out. I think he started in 2012. He must have been in his early 20s then. I remember thinking, oh yeah, not so many people are watching. And now 10 years later, he's going at the RNC, speaking on stage with Donald Trump. He's this national figure that politicians throughout the globe are mourning. They're posting on their accounts, we mourn Charlie Kirk. It just shows how this figure really had a big role. Many people saw him as a rising star, might have a presidential campaign somewhere in his future. And so there's so much more to say. I guess I'll pass it to you, Josh, now.
Yeah, my heart weeps. I was at work today and everyone was shocked that this happened. Everyone who saw the video was worried but hopeful. Unfortunately, he was killed in cold blood. It is so horrific that people in this country could do that. And to take out a man who, number one, now, as you said, is leaving behind a wife and two children and was cut down in the prime of what he was able to offer, but also a person who was a tremendously good human being. And he dedicated his life to free debate and speech. If you've watched videos of him, he didn't believe in ad hominem attacks. He didn't yell. He wasn't divisive. He had his opinions, and yes, they were countercultural to the liberal ideology, but they were fairly moderate right-wing perspectives. They were grounded in religious philosophy. He was very gentle and calm in debating. He never yelled. He never called anyone names. If you watch even one debate, he held a Turning Point USA conference about a month or two ago. There was a debate between Josh Hammer and Dave Smith, and it was a very divisive debate between the two of them. And sometimes it did devolve into ad hominems. And anytime one of them crept into name calling, Charlie Kirk said, "Whoa, that's not what we do. We don't do that." He was able to really bridge the gap between these different worlds within the conservative movement, because I think he really did feel a deep respect for opinions and actual diverse thinking, and stayed and strayed away from ideological purity, and that man would be murdered as if he is some sort of political cannon who fires crazy takes and divisive ideas is so sad to me for the state of this country and the nature of the discourse that we find ourselves in. I have no words. Ben Shapiro tweeted in a very appropriate way He said, I am utterly stunned and heartbroken and sick to my soul. It is unimaginable to write these words. I met Charlie Kirk when he was 18 years old, a young man so eager and determined that I immediately turned to a friend and said, that kid is going to be the head of the RNC one day. Charlie became even bigger and more important than that. It was a privilege to watch this principled man stand up for his beliefs and create the single most important conservative political organization in America. But more importantly, Charlie was a good man, a man who believed in right and wrong, who stood by his biblical values. All of us will miss him, and I can't imagine the pain of his beautifully young family, and we must all pray for them. We must pick up the baton where Charlie left it, fighting for the things he believed in. And I think what really encapsulates the feeling as he finishes here is, and we must fight for a better America where good people can speak truth and debate passionately without fear of a bullet. I weep for Charlie's family, and I weep for my country today. Most of all, I weep for Charlie. My heart is just broken and stunned, and I really feel as though, and this is what we could talk about, this is a turning point, as you said. I think we all watched the Trump assassination attempt, but because he survived and it was so defiant, it was a turning point in the election, but ultimately it's not the same as someone who is openly political being shot down, and really reminds me of Martin Luther K's or RFK's assassinations, where society has just been broken and people feel like they need to pick up a gun in order to solve their political gripes. That is a very scary turning point. Increasingly, it feels like we're living in the 1960s. Terrorists, political assassinations, radical rhetoric coming from all over, and people feeling so divided. It's very scary, and I hope we could heal from this, but I don't know what happens next.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously this is very raw information and there's a lot of emotional intensity right now. But I think we have to start to try to put this in the broader political context. First of all, the news moves very fast. If you remember with the Trump assassination attempts, the discussion of who the shooter was, it was very muted, right? And very quickly, the question moved on. Even now, the shooter is at large. It's not clear who it is and what would be their motivation. Is it someone from the left? Is it someone from the far right? Is it a deranged person? It's probably not smart to even start to speculate about that. But I think also what we see is, I want to make 2 points. Firstly, I wanted to look up videos of Charlie Kirk speaking on a campus with a bunch of students. And Charlie Kirk rarely came to elite universities. He rarely came to Ivy League. In fact, from what I could tell, he only spoke once at an Ivy League university. Maybe he had private audiences in these universities, but no big public events at the big American Ivies. And as some of our listeners know, I'm actually a student in an Ivy League university. And, I can say that this whole legacy of asking questions on campus and free discussion, the place it's most missing is in the Ivy Leagues, in America's elite universities. You see Charlie Kirk's movement, it was not of the Columbias and the Harvards and the Yales. It was a movement of state universities. It was students in, universities out in middle America, large, massive universities with tens of thousands of students, where Charlie Kirk would come and be a presence, and that's what his movement was. And I'm sure there were chapters of the Turning Point USA movement on bigger private Ivy League campuses, but it wasn't as popular there. And I think that reflects that at this point in American history, there's more free speech and open discussion in a state university out in the middle of Utah than in America's capitals or largest cities. And that's really what Charlie Kirk's movement was all about. It's funny, I sometimes walk around my campus and I see all these signs that say, voicing the unvoiced. And I think to myself, on this campus, this is the most voiced campus in the world. No one here they have too much of a voice. But it's out there in Utah where Charlie Kirk would come to speak to people who maybe only have social media, struggling with unemployment, some of those students. That's where he was really voicing the unvoiced and bringing light to that generation. And I think that another element here is that Charlie Kirk built a movement. You have a lot of podcasters today. People, they start a show and, they just sort of maybe did an impressive piece of journalism or very fiery on their show, but they didn't necessarily build something. But Charlie Kirk, his podcast actually came later in his career. He started a podcast once everyone else had really started a podcast. He was actually much more about going places. He would host big rallies and bring people in. When Candace Owens, unfortunately, I think he continued to have a relationship with Candace Owens, but she was one of the people he helped become popular. Many of these figures on the right who became popular, they became popular by being invited to a Turning Point USA conference that he would go. throughout the country. So he really built something. It wasn't just his talking points. It was really a movement, right? And I think with him gone at such a young age, it's leaving a vacuum, not only in the Institute of Turning Point itself, but in this sort of young right-wing movement, which is really at a turning point, right? Trump is very old, and Trump is the face of MAGA, right? But Trump is not going to be here forever, even if we get him to do a third term somehow. But, right, putting that aside, and the conservative youth, first of all, conservative youth movements are always very fragile. I think something Charlie used to talk about is that when he was young, he would go to these Republican political operatives and say, hey, why can't we get our message out to more young people? Why don't you come to university? And they said, that's just a hopeless cause. We're wasting our time there. He really changed that. And he had record numbers of non-college educated males coming out to vote for Trump, which is reflective of his legacy. Charlie Kirk himself did not go to college. And it was a record number of young people voting for Trump, even if most of them probably didn't go to college. Like I said, college, Charlie Kirk knew that colleges were the heart of anti-Americanism in the United States, where people are basically taught socialism. Why? Because their professor told them to believe in socialism. Even their high school teacher taught them to believe in socialism. But Charlie Kirk was pushing back against that. He was pushing back against this powerful force of the universities. And I think just my comment before about the Ivy Leagues reflects that in the Ivy Leagues, that movement was put aside. There was no conservative voice in the Ivy League, and free speech remains pretty silent there. The only way that might change is with enforcement from the administration. To go back to Charlie, his death is a strike to the youth conservative movement. But not just that, it also leaves a vacuum in the sense that who is going to, where is the youth conservative movement going to go? And what I mean by that is Charlie Kirk, again, he was a millennial. He was not Gen Z. He was actually evangelical Christian, which is increasingly something that is there are less evangelical Christians in the United States. And very impressively, Charlie Kirk was very open about that. He publicly stated his beliefs in God, and that was very impressive. And he didn't force it upon people. He was being very open about that. And it was really impressive to see him do that so respectfully. And I think that his belief in God made him a very principled person, and he had a lot of integrity. Anyone who works in politics, it's a very slippery job. He had to work with difficult people and toe the line on different things. He was close with Trump, and no doubt these things are complicated. But as much as he could, I think he brought integrity to his job, as opposed to a lot of people who are basically in it to make money or just get popular and get clicks. And, of course, I will say, Turning Point has a plenty clickbait movement. Okay, like Charlie Kirk ashes liberals questions. But to be fair, Milton Friedman also has videos on the internet saying Milton Friedman destroys students' questions like Dixie Cup. Okay, but I think to the extent possible, he brought integrity into that job. And it's really hard. Today we see that there's no integrity in political commentary out there. There's so much fake, and you see people just follow trends. I think he really tried to the extent that he could to bring his true beliefs and what he really believed in. That's also pretty inspiring.
Yeah. To comment on your points, I think on your first point that what he brought to college campuses was a voice that was previously unknown, and is what makes his murder and assassination all the more tragic. Somebody who was creating a grassroots movement for the people without a voice, like you're saying, who the liberal Democrats should be championing. These people are unrepresented and they should have a voice. That man was then struck down is so sad, and as he served as the emblem for this idea that everybody has a voice, that free speech is the cradle of this nation and it should not be given up on college campuses by fear and ostracization. So I think that, of course, his death is tragic regardless, but it's so much more haunting that this man who just tried to give the underrepresented a voice was seen as a villain, such that somebody was willing to pull the trigger. He didn't do anything that I could see as a reason to murder other than trying to represent a different viewpoint. We don't know who yet, and we don't know what the motivation was, but clearly, it has to do with the fact that this was Charlie Kirk and that he could be interpreted as a villain that needed to be assassinated, again, is, I think, a very scary indicator for this country. And on your second point about where this leaves the conservative movement, I think it is also very scary because he was a moderating force. He was friends with Tucker Carlson, and he was also at the same time taking over for Dennis Prager's radio show while Dennis Prager has been injured with a back injury. he was able to do both of those things. On the one hand, be friends with Dave Smith and Tucker Carlson, and at the same time be extremely close with Dennis Prager, be seen as the next in line to take over Dennis Prager's show. I think just speaks to the fact that he was kind of the Henry Clay of the Republican Party, the great negotiator. To not have that figure is so tragic, and I think it will, of course, this type of thing, that when this happens, only it creates more radicalization, and that's something we don't need right now. And so yeah, it just makes all the conditions surrounding this make it so much worse. I totally agree with you. He really did stand up for his values. He never wavered on his support for the things that he believed in. He didn't fear the ostracization. He didn't fear political pressure. He, of course, had to play politics sometimes, but ultimately was a man who stood by his principles. To lose a human being like that is a tragedy for all of us.
All right. I want to make two more points. Firstly, we mentioned the historical perspective. Movements, when they lose a leader, can be very destabilizing. You look at the civil rights movement, and when Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were shot, it was very destabilizing for the civil rights movement. And the 70s was a much more ugly time.
You get the rise of Malcolm X, when
Right.
the Black Panthers, when you don't have the moderating force of Martin Luther.
Right. And I think political force often needs someone to shape it. And I guess there's concern, there's also cult elements that can emerge when there's too much of a leader like that. When someone's dead, it's one thing for them to become a cult. People want to mourn the dead, and that's very important. But someone who can be the leader of a movement but not become a cult, I think that is a problem we have in the United States. I'm a supporter of the president, but people would argue there's a cult following around President Trump, around all sorts of things. And this is not a healthy thing for our politics. When someone's shot, and it's sort of it's funny because obviously Charlie Kirk was a very popular, he was a leader of the generation, but there are other young conservative podcasters out there. And to be fair, I think his shooting has now made him a martyr, right? And now made him this jewel of the youth conservative movement, as they say. I think the people attribute it to Voltaire. I'm not sure who really said it. I disagree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. Whoever, shot Charlie Kirk has, sent Charlie Kirk into his fame has shot up. And then I'll say one other thing. I do want to talk about this briefly, and you can respond if you have comments, and if not, that's okay. But I think Charlie Kirk, like you said, he was very close with Dennis Prager, and he was, because of some of his evangelical beliefs and his proud and unabashed belief in the Bible and God, he was a fan of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. He really, as pro-Israel advocates, he often said, even as a lot of anti-Israel movement starts to arise within the conservative movement, I was listening to him talk to young conservatives about Israel, and they were saying they weren't necessarily the biggest fans of Israel. And I think that's important to me. I think that's something I wanted to say about him, that he really did care about the state of Israel. And of course he had to, he wasn't going to deplatform people just because they were anti-Israel. But on the other hand, he wasn't, kowtowing to, oh, wow, this is the new, okay, now it's in vogue to be anti-Israel, so I'm just going to follow the road trip. No, he wanted to debate and he held on to his beliefs. I think that's really inspiring. And even as the Jewish community has lost a lot, and I guess I'll say one thing about that. The Jewish community obviously has many advocates who are Jewish, but the point is, when someone who's not Jewish is playing that role, it's a very special person and a very special role. And we could talk about that in the context of Jewish history. There is this role of the righteous Gentile, right? Like we don't need to necessarily make this just about Jewish issues, but I think there is something, very unique about the Douglas Murrays out there, the people who are not Jewish, but they have a connection to the Jewish nation. And that's something very special, not to be ignored.
Right. And I do think it was a huge part of who he was. Like you said, he was prepared to talk about and push back against the rising anti-Semitism, even in, just very obvious conspiratorial ways. Where there was two clips, I think, that were circulating. One was somebody explicitly asked him about Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, and he very much pushed back. He didn't mention them by name in his response, but he said, basically, these people offer you nothing. They're not telling you how to live a better life. They're not progressing anything in virtue in any way, and you should not live your life listening to people who are not helping you live a better life. And I think that really speaks to who he was as a person, that was his chief interest, as we've spoken about in this podcast, that the conspiracy theories are what keeps young men and women sad by telling them that all their problems are someone else's fault. And he did not believe in that, which is why he was such a popular person on campus. He would go to these campus events and tell them, you need to take responsibility for yourself. In that sense, kind of the same way why Jordan Peterson became so popular. It's very attractive, of course, to be told all your problems are someone else's fault, but sometimes what you actually need, I mean, all the time what you actually need, but what is also sometimes very reassuring to hear is this is actually on you and you need to shape up, and you not only have that responsibility, but you can if you try. And I think that's what he really believed in, that the conservative movement could be a party not just of grievance, but as you said, of building something. Another clip I saw of him was that someone asked him that, Jews control the world and the Talmud says this. And he was well versed enough to say that's not what the Talmud says. He knew about the history of Christian anti Semitism, and he called this person out and was able to very elegantly but kindly, without yelling, without raising his voice, without ad hominems, he was able to explain why the theory was incorrect. When we lose someone like that, I think you're right. People don't take the Jewish voices as seriously. They're much easier to discount. Oh, Ben Shapiro, he's only saying that because he's Jewish. Oh, Barry Weiss, she's only saying that because she's Jewish. But when you have Douglas Murray, he's not Jewish. He doesn't live in Israel. He's a homosexual British man who has no vested interest in protecting the Jews other than, I think this is the truth, that carries a lot more weight. And I think Charlie Kirk was someone who was also representative of that. But to get back to a different point on political martyrdom, I think another historical comparison that this reminds me of is an often overlooked moment in history, which was the murder of Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy was a pro-abolitionist newspaper reporter and pastor in the 1800s, and he eventually moved to Illinois and was murdered for being pro-abolition to end slavery by pro-slavery voices from Missouri who shot him outside of his newspaper printing factory. In that sense, it reminds me a lot of kind of this just politically murdering people for simply disagreeing and voicing that disagreement, not utilizing politics, but instead resorting to violence. But also that in the wake of that murder, it radicalized the abolitionist movement and inspired a famous abolitionist named John Brown, who said he was directly influenced by that voice. And John Brown was not talking in the newspaper about abolition. He was far more radical, creating raids on Harper's Ferry and actually revolting against the slavery
Well,
movement.
why don't you tell the story of Harper? Like, say exactly what happened to John Brown and what he did.
So in John Brown, this is already later, but I think it was
Shortly before the Civil War.
He was actually also an evangelical Christian. This is the 1850s. He lived in Kansas and he wanted Kansas. This was at the time when it was unclear whether Kansas would be a free or a slave state. He thought that the abolitionists were too pacifist. Again, very similar to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And just to quote here, he said, "These men are all talk. What we need is action." And what he did is over multiple parts of his life, but in the most famous one in 1859, he led a raid on an armory at Harper's Ferry in Virginia because he wanted to start a similar to Nat Turner's rebellion, basically this huge revolt of slaves against the owners. And he was tried for treason, and he was guilty, and he was hanged, and he became also a martyr. That created a huge motivation for what eventually became the secession and then eventual Civil War. But the point is, when we lose the peaceful voices, we descend into further levels of chaos. And instead, what we need to do is stopgap the descent, and instead step back and end political violence. And that is why it is so important that this murder is condemned on all levels. No, but he had a point. No, similar to when Luigi Mangione died, sympathizing with Luigi Mangione, vilifying Brian Thompson, who he murdered. We need to just full stop. Doesn't matter why this happened or how justified the person thinks he is. We need to condemn that this was bad. And for the most part, even the Democrats are saying that. I'm sure, and I have already seen online, we will get a lot of gun moderation, that we should, if we just restrict gun laws, this wouldn't happen. Of course, that is just ridiculous. This is not an NRA activist who has rifles.
I think that we have a wide variety of listeners on this show, and we should say that gun violence in America is something pretty unique to the United States. We spoke about that last week, thanks to Lord Grantley's email, and we will talk about it more because it's a real thing in the United States. If you go to a country like England, England has a much more conservative temperament, even if it's maybe a much more left-wing country in many ways. But, guns allow for the igniting of the violence.
Yes.
And I think on a philosophical level, I want to bring what you said to a philosophical level. We talk about Hobbes and Hobbes' concept of state of nature and how a political society is basically free people surrendering their rights to a state in return for some level of order. But obviously, they don't surrender all their rights. They don't maybe surrender their right to free speech. And when there's an act of violence, it's someone who takes back that right to violence and says, well, I don't surrender that right to the state. And to connect this to your point about guns, the fact that there are guns in America means that it's a bit easier to reclaim that right to violence. In times of intense political division, when people are wondering what is the true future of this society, there are some people who, unfortunately, whether it's because they're mentally disabled or whatever, they're an ideologue, whoever this person was who shot Charlie Kirk, they reveal to us that state of nature can be, we could go back to the state of nature. And it doesn't have to be where violence is surrendered to the state. People could take back that right to violence. And I think that as terrible as gun violence is, maybe America needs some level of reckoning. We could talk about that in another episode. It also reflects that in America, our political debates are very real. I think there are many countries where there's not as much free speech, maybe not as much political representation, especially in Europe, there's not so much free speech. And people give up on these discussions. It's not as real. In France right now, there's lots of rioting, but is it really going to change anything? I don't know. But in the United States, in this terrible way, nonetheless, we see the power of politics. And obviously, we never want politics to come to this level that a man, for just expressing his opinion, many common sense opinions, should lose his life, and his wife and his children are now, their life is destroyed. But it reflects that this is a country where ideas really matter.
I think, to put it in concrete terms, as much as people don't want to admit, this was a nation built on ideas. And the American Revolution, which again, the country was built in revolution, is always one step away from becoming the French Revolution. And that the only way to prevent the American Revolution from becoming the French Revolution is with a strong government program and strong institutions. And when people feel like those institutions are failing them and that Donald Trump is president and it's Charlie Kirk's fault, I'm not saying that's the motivation, but it seems to be that that's at least the rhetoric that's being spewed, and that democracy is dying and the Supreme Court is corrupt and the Senate and Congress aren't doing anything, then that is how you descend into the kind of Jacobin violence that we see, and that we, like you said, terribly and tragically saw with our very eyes today. A man mowed down and cut down in the prime of his life. And it's just so hard to see. But I think this is a turning point in America. I hope it isn't so, but it really seems to be that way.
And I
We'll
think
look
that,
back on this moment.
Right. And I think that reflects the level of contingency in history. I was just talking to someone about like Obamacare, and when Obamacare was passed, so there were like 60 Democratic seats for it in the Senate. And then Ted Kennedy died, who was this Democratic senator. And the next senator in Massachusetts was a Republican. And that changed all of history around Obamacare. We see here that's so contingent, which was the direction the conservative movement was going to go. How, Donald Trump being shot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Had Donald Trump died, who knows how history would have gone?
Yeah. And
who
if he
knows?
wasn't shot, by the way, I don't think Kamala would have won, but you never,
Maybe
that
he
was a
wouldn't have won,
huge,
right.
yeah, I'm saying that was a huge political boost for him right before the Republican National Convention. And I'm saying we know, not that, again, historians don't like the idea that World War I started because of Ferdinand being killed, but yeah, Franz Ferdinand was
but contingency is right.
It was a part of the descent into chaos.
I think that's
Europe.
Right, and I think that's my point, which is on the one hand,
Rabin and Israel. I mean, these are huge changes that rely on one man.
Right. It's that irony that, Charlie Kirk fought for his ideas and he believed in the power of ideas. He was such a great representation of that. And yet we also see the power of human action against ideas. And it's all these things are coming into play and we don't even know how it's going to turn out. And I hope that, like you said, ideas win out and violence is not the answer. I guess we could say, thank God the federal government has a general monopoly over violence. Although sometimes you see that disrupted as you did today. it's an important point to reflect on the extent to which ideas build history, and then ideas can lead to, maybe this man was driven by crazy ideas about the world and his hatred of Charlie Kirk. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we see history in motion today. Obviously, I don't think we need to over exaggerate, but nonetheless, he was a very important figure. It's a tragic day.
Yeah, and we pray for his family and his children who now have to grow up without a father. We hope that nobody ever has to know that these little children, little kids, and it's horrible to think about, but here's to better days, here's to a better America, and we hope that things will be better soon.
Yeah. And before we sign off in a second, I just want to give one more historical example. Julius Caesar, probably the greatest political assassination in history. We shouldn't have a show about political assassination without mentioning Julius Caesar. That who knows if the Roman Empire would have emerged had he not been assassinated by the people who sought to defend the Roman Empire. And so the people today who maybe shot Charlie Kirk, and again, we don't know why he was shot. Maybe he was shot, who knows? But if the people who were maybe seeking that, we got to shoot Charlie Kirk because he's a fascist or something, maybe this is what will unleash fascism. I don't know, but
no, the Reichstag fire that I keep mentioning, the political moments like this that get everyone's attention is, they're not great moments for society. And like you said, Augustus was able to rise to power in the vacuum of Caesar. These vacuums are never good, and violence to solve issues end up creating downstream effects, because once, like you said, taking the call to arms to engage in political violence is rejection of the government. So you're essentially giving the permission structure for tyranny. You don't want that. And we hope that
I think I saw on the news, people were comparing this to Socrates being killed. They say that all philosophy is just footnotes to Plato, and Plato was a student of Socrates. But, I don't know if Charlie Kirk was a Socrates, but it's definitely true that he was asking questions. He just wanted to have a discussion, and he represented that he was so proud of the West. And so, I think we saw history made today. And like you said, we wish only good things. God bless America, and hope for the best.
Yeah. We wish everybody well. We'll be back next week. Here's to better days.